This is 8.2.1, spoofing and sniffing. So at the end of this lesson, we should be able to define different spoofing-based attacks like ARP poisoning, IP spoofing, and DNS spoofing. We should be able to identify how spoofing is used for adversary in the middle and DDoS attacks, as well as identify different methods of securing against spoofing. So spoofing attacks are essentially when an unauthorized person gets access to data so that they can read it, which would be a breach of confidentiality, or so that they can change the data, or so that they could add malware. And both of those would be examples of a breach of integrity. So there are many ways for an attacker to pretend that they're a different system. It's possible to spoof identifiers like an IP address, a MAC address, or even a URL. And in this section, we're going to review different spoofing methods and see how sniffing integrates with many of these attacks. So IP spoofing is really simple. It fakes the source IP address of a packet or a series of packets to make it look like data is coming from a different source. It's got a couple different uses. You get access to a network even though you are located externally. In other words, you're fooling external routers into allowing entry for packets by making them believe it originated internally. Another use, you can cover your tracks by masking who you are. Another use would be you create a scenario where you request something from websites using the victim's IP address so that responses are then delivered to them. IP spoofing sounds like a great tool until you realize that it has a major flaw. The source IP address is used by the receiving system as a means to send replies. So if you send a packet with spoofed IP addresses, then any replies, including the three-way handshake messages, are going to go to the spoofed address and not to you. So this by itself won't work as a means of sending bidirectional packets while also hiding your identity. There are ways to use it with additional software to get around those problems, but there are also better ways of staying anonymous online. So what's this good for? It masks who you are. Like we saw in the previous slide, it can be used as a method of fooling external routers into allowing entry for packets by making them believe that it originated internally. And then it's also going to deliver malware, which is just a drop and go kind of thing. You don't need a reply after sending the malware packet. So here's an example of using IP spoofing to create a DDoS. In this Smurf attack, a ping request is sent from one computer, but all replies are redirected to the target computer. The attacker uses source IP spoofing. So attacks like the Smurf attack are a good reason to block the ping protocol as a mitigation method. ARP poisoning. So eavesdropping on a network used to be really easy. All you had to do was plug into a hub and you were good to go because hubs forwarded all of the messages to all of the connected devices. So now that we use switches, it's a little bit harder to sniff a network because switches will only forward messages to the MAC address of the intended receiver. So to get around this block, the malicious actor must find a way to spoof this address. This is possible by abusing the ARP protocol through ARP poisoning. On the next couple of slides, you're going to see a visualization of how ARP works normally, and then how ARP poisoning can achieve what we call an adversary in the middle attack, or an AITM. Sniffing, also known as eavesdropping, is the objective of ARP poisoning to capture messages between two devices on the network. You should note that this attack only works in a local area network because it relies on packets being delivered based on their MAC address. So remember that a switch connects devices in a LAN, and it only uses the MAC address to make deliveries. If the malicious actor wanted to eavesdrop on messages between devices on different networks, this ARP poison technique isn't going to work because it takes a router to move packages between LANs and routers rely on IP addresses to make delivery decisions. So in the next 3 slides, we're going to see how ARP is abused through ARP poisoning. So let's look at Bob and Tanaya. In this slide, we see ARP working normally. Bob's computer sends out a broadcast ARP request for the MAC address that belongs to 10.0.0.1. Tanaya's computer replies that she is 10.0.0.1 and provides her MAC address. And then Bob's computer is going to store the matching IP and MAC addresses in his ARP cache to make future communications easier. In this slide, we see the ARP messages being used for an attack. So first, the malicious actor is going to send out an ARP reply to let one target on the network know that his MAC address should be associated with 10.0.0.1. And then another actor is going to send out another ARP reply on the network that his MAC address should be associated with 10.0.0.3. So even though they never asked the question, Bob and Tanaya's computers will update their ARP caches with new information. Stateless means that it doesn't need to do things in a certain order, and it doesn't keep track of any previous events. So the normal order of business is for someone to make an ARP request, and then there's an ARP reply. But since ARP is stateless, it's fine with just getting replies that it never asked for. And then gratuitous means uncalled for, lacking good reason, unwarranted, no one asked. So why did we get a reply? So in effect, the attacker has just misrepresented themselves to the 2 targets so that each will send their packets to the malicious actor instead of sending the packets to each other. The malicious actor has poisoned Bob and Tanaya's ARP caches. And this is the basis for what we call an adversary in the middle attack, AITM, which we'll discuss more on the next slide. Using ARP poisoning, the attacker is going to be able to intercept all messages between the 2 victim devices. And that is an adversary in the middle attack, or an AITM. You should be aware that this type of attack used to be known as a man-in-the-middle attack, or an MITM. But the cybersecurity industry is trying to move towards being more inclusive, and AITM is a recommended replacement term. So a version of this attack is used on mobile devices. The adversary in the mobile, ATMO attack, previously known as man-in-the-mobile, MITMO attack, is used to take control over a user's mobile device. And when infected, the mobile device is instructed to grab user-sensitive information and then send it to the attackers. Zeus is one example of a malware package with ATMO capabilities. It allows attackers to quietly capture 2-step verification SMS messages that are sent to users. So this slide is just a reminder of how DNS works normally. The next slide is going to show how DNS can be abused. So the user is going to open a browser and they're going to enter the URL www.realwebsite.com. And then the computer is automatically going to look in its local DNS cache to see if the info is there. If the user had recently visited www.realwebsite.com, then the info would be in the cache, but in this case, it's not there. The computer then sends a request to the designated DNS server to provide the IP address for www.realwebsite.com. The DNS server provides the correct information, and the user's request is going to arrive at the correct destination. So DNS poisoning, or DNS spoofing, is an attack where false data is introduced into a DNS database or a computer's DNS cache, which is the temporary database on a computer's operating system that records recent visits to websites and other internet domains. So if you have ever heard you should clear your cache as a troubleshooting method, that's where that term comes from. So here's an example of attack steps for this image right here. So first, the DNS server has the correct information for a real website that says URL realwebsite.com equals IP address. What is it? I don't know if it's on here, but let's say it's 13.201.5.4. So the attacker is going to use malware or an exploit to get into the DNS server that manages the real website info. Then the attacker changes the database entry to read URL realwebsite.com equals IP address 56.3.89.6. So this IP address belongs to fake website. So we call that poisoning because it just inserts false info into the DNS database. And then finally, any computer that asks for DNS resolution for www.realwebsite.com is going to be given that IP address, 56.4.89.6. So there are many ways to implement spoofing and just as many methods to mitigate. On this slide, we see two basic steps to help protect the network against spoofing attacks. So first, router ingress filtering. I'm sure that many of y'all aren't familiar with the term ingress for entry and egress for exit. The concept's really simple. So even though a packet says it's from inside the network, if it's actually entering through an external door or an interface on the network router, then something's pretty fishy. The solution would be to shut down the whole thing entirely, but set the router to look at the IP address in conjunction with the interface so that the filtering can take place if they don't match. And then you should also note that that doesn't stop IP spoofing from happening inside the network, and it can't stop someone from using your IP as their mask for an attack. Encryption is going to offer multiple ways to protect digital data, so we say that it's the go-to solution to avoid spoofing.